Okay, we're back after the break. If anybody has any questions directed towards the general issue, which is, of course, sensitivity training issues in the primary and second school environment with respect to disabled students, and the converse, which would be coping skills development for the disabled student so that those students can better deal with stressors in that environment. Dr. Szajnberg.
Society has odd balancing mechanisms. I'll give you an example of this. I was thinking of something that Ms. Ngom said earlier about how prevalent is treating people nastily? How prevalent is that? And what does it have to do with society? There was a very nice study done by sociologists and psychoanalysts in the 1940s. It's by Morris Janowitz and Bruno Bettelheim. Nobody reads it anymore, but I recently reviewed it for a journal. And here's what the study was. The American Jewish Committee went to Janowitz and Bettelheim and said, would you do a study of anti-Semitism, the prevalence of anti-Semitism in the greater Chicago area and returning GIs? And the first thing that Janowitz and Bettelheim says is that we'll only do this if you let us look at prejudice against Negroes, which was what the term was used at the time, and Jews, because they felt that you couldn't get a real sense of prejudice unless you looked at those two major groups against whom prejudice was significant. So they went out and interviewed every 9th returning GI in the greater Chicago area. This was before there were tape recorders. They transcribed all the interviews by hand, and they looked at them. And here's what they found out. There were different degrees of prejudice, and there were different types of prejudice. The prejudice against the Negro was significant and different than the prejudice against the Jew, highly stereotyped. So first thing, their impulse to look at both groups for prejudice was an important one, because it was prevalent, but it was very different. But they found that roughly, if you just asked what percentage of these returning GIs, and the reason they looked at returning GIs was that post-World War I in Germany, Nazism was attractive to returning GIs who had been heroes in the war and couldn't get a darn job in deeply depressed Germany. And so Bettelheim and Janowitz said, these are the high-risk guys. These are the guys who are going to act on their prejudice. They come back from World War II. They were sacrificing themselves, maybe their lives, certainly risking their lives. And they come back and they're looking for work. And some of them get it, and some of them don't. And they purposely wanted to look at privates. They did not look at officers. They wanted to look at the average GI Joe, quite literally. So what they found is roughly something like this. I don't remember exactly the percentages. But if you just asked who was prejudiced against either Jews or blacks or both, it's about 54%, 51%. Big number. But then they looked carefully at defining prejudice. There were 4 groups who were prejudiced. There was the hardcore group, way at like around 12 to 14%. They said, I hate Jews, I hate blacks, I would hurt them or kill them. The only thing that stops me is that if I did it, I'd be caught and punished. That's it. Those are hardcores. Then you go up the next percentage to about 20-some%, and they say, I really hate Jews and blacks. I don't say this out loud. But if because if I said it out loud, my minister would be on my ass. Or my neighbors. But really, you can't trust Jews because of this, and you can't trust blacks because of this. That's what I really think. And by the way, both those guys have got my job that I really want. The job that I really want. Both the Jews and the blacks took it from me. Then you go up the next third, and there's guys who say, I don't really hate them, but they really are different, and they're really not trustworthy, and they're slick, or they're lazy, or blah, blah, blah. But of course I don't hate them, and I wouldn't ever do anything bad to them. Then you go to the top quartile, and it's a little softer. It says, they're different than us, what can I say? We have a better culture and ethnicity, blah, blah, blah. But, whenever I say it to my wife, she really gets on my case, so I don't tell her that. I just talk about it at the bar. Now, they looked a little more carefully then and asked, why do in some societies, people act on their prejudice and some societies don't? And now Bettelheim and Janowitz did this in response to Theodore Adorno's book, The Authoritarian Personality. It was in response to that, and they had a different finding than Adorno. They said, there's a balance in society. You can have laws against prejudice, lots of laws. But if there's a societal will that undermines the laws will be stepped aside or undermined or whatever. For instance, in Tsarist Russia, there's a law against murder. You're not allowed to murder. But periodically, the Tsar knew that he had to have pogroms for the peasants to kill the Jews. So he would pull the police out of the villages. For one weekend, the peasants would go in, because they knew when the weekends were, kill, rape, and pillage a few Jews, and then the police were sent back in on Monday, right after, Sunday church. Do you see how the law, it was against the law, but there are ways around it. The same is true in contemporary society. If we see, for instance, a concern about our current Attorney General designate, he may be obligated to pursue the law as Attorney General, but if he talks like, I don't know if I have the resources to support people who are against abortion, et cetera, then people in society who are prone to break that law will either find a way to break it or get around it. And society looks away from it. Do you see? So what you're describing, I think it's an intriguing concept of how your son was able to get a certain degree of compassion and thoughtfulness that he maybe didn't get in his formal schooling. Maybe he did get it and he was able to manifest it more formally. But while law is a central part of our society, I have to say this, I'm sitting between two lawyers, there are ways that laws tend to be, I think it was Dickens, who said it was in Bleak House, it's a blunt instrument. It catches the flies and the bats go through, like a spider's web. The bats will always get through. But it's important to have it, but it's also important to have a societal attitude that supports the laws. And the other side of law that I was told recently, there's law and there is justice. And the law is written in straight lines and justice has, variability around it. So it's applied in a humane manner. Okay, so just from strictly a psychoanalytic, my perspective as a psychoanalyst and a child psychiatrist, developmentally, that stuff that you're describing needs to be taught by 7 years of age. And that means it's going to have to take place in the family.
I totally agree.
That's the dilemma we're facing. You can make preschool programs and do other things like that, but institutions are not usually as successful and a heterogeneous. See, American society is an extraordinary historical experiment. This is the first time we have a heterogeneous society with equal rights that's not imposed from the outside. I mean, the Romans conquered many nations and imposed something upon them. The Greeks did the same. But here you have people who voluntarily come here, essentially change major parts of their identity and try to live together. It's a big experiment in society. So how do you give fundamental beliefs about caring for others and having respect for oneself, both? That's done developmentally by 6 or 7 years of age. Now, can the school do stuff afterwards or immediately? Probably, but it's tough.
The point where the Office for Civil Rights comes in is the point where, okay, so it hasn't happened in the family between 0 and 7, and there's a problem in the school, and then people are coming to us saying, give us a program. Don't you have like a sensitivity series that we can buy and implement here? And it's not that easy.
A program in elementary school, preferably in the younger grades, where children are sensitized by interaction and one-on-one contact and that way they can have a better feel and understanding of what the other person's needs or disability is something that is a mechanism that is beneficial, and you have seen success in this regard, rather than just having a sort of a more amorphous approach, and I think which we've talked about a lot tonight in terms of, communities and community service and institutions and what we can do and what we can't. You would really, take a pen and paper and just say on Monday, this student and that other student, maybe we're going to spend 15 minutes together and develop an interaction, and from that will evolve a sensitization.
This goes to the cost part of the decisions that we make. If you've ever seen a situation where there's a regular ed classroom and a student with a visible disability is introduced into that classroom, and then a very well-meaning teacher says, and there are problems among relations with the students, and a very well-meaning teacher says, okay, we're going to learn about this particular student. We're going to learn about the condition that he or she has. And so the class goes off and tries to study, and I mean, I could see that situation having the adverse impact. Right, no, I know that, and I'm not saying that. I'm asking if you've seen that in working with different schools. Because that's sometimes, unfortunately, the effect of well-meaning teachers who try to bring issues about people who have disabilities into the classroom, and they don't know how. They're not experienced, like the organization that you work with, in dealing with these issues. Instead, it's like the person is sort of made to be a study. When we talk about training, we need training in classrooms, we need training for administrators, that we really can't leave out the part of it that deals with who's going to give this training, who's going to do it, because I think that's often a part that's neglected, and it can lead to really the opposite of what's trying to be achieved.
It's fundamental, and this is not a problem with American society, it's fundamental among humans to be fearful of someone who is the other. There's all sorts of ways of looking at this anthropologically. There's certain colors that are taboo in certain cultures and certain colors that are taboo in other cultures. Black represents death in some cultures and white represents death in other cultures. But the important point is that colors mean something and otherness means something. There's 3 different attitudes culturally towards homosexuality in different cultures. 3 classifications. In some cultures, the homosexual is considered to be powerful like a shaman and dangerous, but powerful. In some cultures, the shaman is called a broken vessel. Nothing wrong with them, but you can't carry water. And in some cultures, the homosexual is debased. This is described by Clifford Geertz in his work. So the important point behind that is that it seems to be fairly human to look at someone other than yourself and feel anxiety towards that person and then treat that person in a different way. How that difference is varies across cultures. A powerful shaman whom you wouldn't want your daughter to get near, a worthless broken vessel, or a debased person. But behind each one of those is that you treat the person who is different, because he's black or Jewish or homosexual or blind or deaf, as something to be anxious about. Differences in cultures about what's funny. In America, for someone to be deaf and to use a horn is considered funny. Comedians made a living off of that, right? In France, that's considered tragic. It would never be considered funny. What is funny in France? Blind people. A blind guy getting on stage and stumbling over something, they laugh all the dickens over. That's not funny in America. Now, I want to be clear here. It's not that America is better than France or France better than America. It's that they're both very human and they have different ways of reacting towards differences amongst us humanly. Another way to look at this is what Erik Erikson talked about, as pseudo-speciation. That one way we handle our anxieties about the other person is say they're really not human. Blacks are less human than I am. Jews are less human than I am. Deaf people are less. Do you see what I mean? There's another way to handle it, which is to say, someone who is congenitally deaf, to say, I'm more human than you are. My way of speaking and understanding the world is much more creative. And for you to take a deaf child from hearing parents and give them an implant is racist and wrong. That is, the child now belongs to the deaf community and not to the parents. And having done evaluations on deaf children of hearing parents, I've heard both sides of that, and I must say as a parent, I'd want my kid to hear. But I also heard something else. Okay, so there's a fundamental problem here, and I don't want to diminish that. One reason that laws are so very important, only one reason, is that regardless of what you think or feel about me, or I about you, by law, I have to treat you and you have to treat me in certain ways. I may not want to stop at the red light because I don't feel like it. But if I go through that red light, I can be arrested and be fined. Period. Well, Judge, I don't care how you felt, Dr. Szajnberg. This is your fine. So the law is very central for that. On the other hand, as an analyst, I want to point out the very human dilemma we're dealing with. Let me return to your example. The program you're describing sounds like a program that was done at Temple Emmanuel. Is that possible? I was a Sunday school teacher there. My kids went through that program. Every week you had that program, week after week, less kids came. They didn't want to do this. They thought most of them were weird. By the last day, I had hardly any kids in my classroom. So what I would say is, I'm less interested in what you're doing in training, frankly, than what's the effect upon the kids and is it being effective? If the kids are staying home, it's not being effective. They missed the whole day of Sunday school. You know, and the parents would say to me, what does it have to do with their studying for their bar mitzvah? And I could try to fabricate an answer, but it was a stretch. It was a stretch. Not impossible, but it was a stretch. You see? So it's, you know, what is the impact upon the kid? I remember once when I was in Hartford as head of child psychiatry, I was asked to be involved in some sort of, disseminating information on pregnancy prevention. And there's this volunteer group of women from the wealthy suburbs around Hartford going in and handing out pamphlets. Hartford is basically two communities, Black northern community, Puerto Rican southern community, and a little tip of southern Italy where if any black or Hispanic person went, they got killed. Cars suddenly just sort of automatically drove up on the curb and hit people, just ran out of control, okay? So these ladies who come from Farmington and so on, and they go to these black and Hispanic high schools and say, don't get pregnant. I said, oh, I see. How do they measure their effectiveness? Well, by how many pamphlets they hand out. And I, as a doctor, think, what's this? And they looked at me like, what's wrong with that? Do you see? So as a doctor, it's like, if I put a kid on an antibiotic, that's not enough. I need to know, does he respond to it? Does she get better? And if not, I change it. And it depends on who fills out the evaluations. You won't hear evaluations from the kids in the last week of my program because there are very few left. And the parents who will fill it out are going to do politically correct things. They know people to be polite. I didn't fill it out because I didn't want to say what happened because I support the idea. I know that. You heard it.
Dr. Szajnberg, let me ask you this: are there any studies that would show any kind of methodical means to determine at what point the benefits are outweighed by the detriment? I mean, as you described it, the detriment is that it's disinteresting to the students and they're going to drop out of class, but certainly there must be some point, I don't know how to get there, I guess that's my question, where the benefits of this developing an interpersonal relationship with a different person due to a disability would clearly outweigh the end result as you described at Temple Emmanuel. I mean, how would we go about differentiating or finding as best we could that point where, without throwing the whole program out, but just using it to benefit the students?
Right. The short answer is I don't know of studies like that. People probably do it. I don't know. The longer answer is this sounds like a nice opportunity to learn something. just exactly what you're doing. You're doing it, and, how do you do it better? It's like, with psychotherapy, it's important to do it, and I always look at how can we do it better? How do we improve on it? Well, let me suggest another approach to this. And what if we treated our public schools as if they were private schools? Now, I know because my former wife taught in several very prestigious private schools, hotshot places. It was interesting for me to learn. First thing, private schools never make money. And I think, a fundamental problem in contemporary American society is we're expecting two places to make money, in medical treatment and in education. And if you look at how wealthy people do things, really wealthy people, they send their kids to private schools, and they don't expect the private schools to make a profit. In fact, it costs them a hunk of dough. Besides the tuition, they have to pay for the building fund too, and they get hit up for endowments and all that. So the idea that our school system should somehow make money or break even or whatever, that's perhaps the way education is that it can't do that, like with medicine. But I would approach, so if we approach your school, your local school, and it's a problem because I would suggest, see, Aristotle said that the optimal size for a community is, a city-state is about, I think it's 15,000. Bigger than that, he said, it's hard to develop a sense of a city-state in a community. It's interesting, a number. Now, of course, he was talking about a time when you didn't have cars, but in ways, cars make community much more difficult, much more challenging. So if you have a school that's your school in your neighborhood, and you go in with the attitude that of something like, I'm delighted my child is here. What can I do for you, Mr. Principal, Ms. Principal, Mr. Teacher, Ms. Teacher? And then see how they respond. Children watch very carefully how adults treat each other and how adults treat children. And we can give them a nice curriculum on how to be respectful to each other, but if I walk in with a belligerent attitude towards the teacher, my kid's going to notice that. By the way, sometimes I want them to notice that. I want them to see that. So my daughter comes by, my daughter who's really smart, my oldest one, and says, well, Dad, I just have to realize that I'm just not as good at math as blah, blah, blah. I said, no, you just haven't been taught it as well. Because you're being taught, I know a little bit about math, you're being taught the numbers of math, not the concepts, and the concepts are what are elegant. And then when I show her this stuff, she said, oh, that's math? So I say, well, your teacher has a responsibility to know how to teach you well, and not for you to say that something's wrong with you. So there are times when I will do something like that. Or I'll say, they're teaching you biology before physics and chemistry, and there's a new study out of the University of Chicago by a Nobel Prize winning physicist that shows that if you teach physics first, then chemistry, then biology, and he's doing it in public schools around the country, kids get smarter. Because physics is really easier than chemistry, and chemistry is easier than biology. It's kind of simple. So I say to my daughter, says, oh, Daddy, but I have such a wonderful school, blah, blah. It's a wonderful school, they just don't have the most up-to-date information about how to teach you well. But one can do it respectfully. So if you go to the school and treat them respectfully, number one, see how they respond. Now, if they don't respond respectfully, you have a problem, But most of the time, I'm surprised at how well they respond. If you walk and you say, not what can you do for me, but I'm so delighted to be here. Tell me what I can do for you. And then expect that of your neighbors. I'm too busy, etc. In Finland, they use the school systems for daycare. If your kid goes to daycare, he goes to the physically local grammar school. And not only do you pay for it in your taxes, you have to donate 2 days every other week as an assistant teacher. Now this is really good because you're going to see what the teacher does with your kids, not just hear about it. And you're going to have to get time off from work to do that. And you're required to by the government so you can get time. Do you see what I mean? How it's sort of...
Bringing the community back?
That's right. And your child gets to see how you treat other children and how you treat the teacher. It makes it a bit more complicated and challenging, but the outcome would be better, I think.
I totally agree.
I think your idea is a wonderful one, and one that, if you don't mind, I'll probably suggest to some schools about, like, having kids sit in a circle and talk about what are we all not good at, But I want to also suggest something else, which is, as an African American woman, when someone that I know is a very, very privileged white person comes up to me and says, "You and me, we're just the same. You've been discriminated against because you're an African American person, but I've been discriminated against too. You know, when I go to the car wash, they make me wait. Not the same." And this happens. It happens all the time. Because I think there's also a human need sometimes to relate to one another. But if I were to go up to somebody who uses a wheelchair, always and forever, and says, "You're no different than me. I'm disabled too because, this is a secret, I can't carry a tune." Not the same at all. And in fact, it's offensive to even suggest that it is. So while I think your idea is an excellent one and probably a very good starting place, I would also suggest that we have to be sensitive that the degrees to which one person might be good at something and not good at another thing, and the degree to which somebody might be have a disability, that they really can be two very, 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 very different worlds, and there has to be some sense.
So what you're saying is similar to the woman from Jewish Family Services, that interaction, maybe even one-on-one or one with a small group on a regular basis, educating other people to the person's differences or special needs, is an area that you've seen eliminate the stressors and or the anxiety, as someone has described it, of not knowing what the other person's like, anxiety of the unknown. All right, I think at this time, the People with Disabilities Foundation would like to thank Dr. Szajnberg and Ms. Encombe. And if anybody needs additional information from either of them, please feel free to contact the People with Disabilities Foundation, which is about half a block from here, and our website is peoplewithdisabilities.org, O-R-G, and we'll be happy to either pass on information in relation to the seminar, and if anyone is interested in finding out about the videotape once we've seen it, please also feel free to contact us. So at this time, we thank you for coming, and we will conclude the seminar.